Thank you for being here. For those of you joining us here at Cathedral Square and those of you joining us online, a hearty welcome on this, well, I thought it was still summer day, but fall is on its way. My name is Mark Mann. I'm the Director of Programs and Institutes here at the Catholic Information Center, and very happy to welcome you all. The ministry of the center creates spaces for encounter, dialogue, and community at the intersection of faith and life. We're a ministry of the Paulist Fathers at service to the Diocese of Grand Rapids. Very happy to welcome Sister Barbara Reid here as our guest presenter. But before I introduce her, I have a few housekeeping and prayer and some introductory remarks. Finally, I want to take an opportunity to thank you for your contributions towards tonight's program. I also want to give a special thanks to the Mission Advancement Office of the Paulist Fathers, whose grant made this evening, as well as the 4 presentations that we're offering in this series, possible. Today, it's fitting that we're talking about Women of Vision because today on the church's calendar, yes, it's St. Gregory the Great, if you follow along, but it's also the feast day of the deaconess St. Phoebe, which we're going to find out more about this evening from Sister Barbara. But let us call on her for her intercession that we too may be people of good news. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. God of love and mercy, you call us to be your people. You gift us with your abundant grace. Make us a holy people, radiating the fullness of your love. Form us into a community, a people who care, expressing your compassion. Remind us day after day of our baptismal call to serve with joy and courage. Teach us how to grow in wisdom and grace and joy in your presence. We ask all this through Christ our Lord. Amen. This evening is the first of 4 presentations. So 4 presentations, and I'll talk at the end, 4 wisdom circles, 4 opportunities to hear about and be introduced, maybe for the first time for some of us, to women of the history of our history of salvation, the history of the church, history of the world. And it presents us with the opportunity to explore the proposals of the final document in the Synod on Synodality. And in particular, page 60, about the role of women in church and society, that we would acknowledge and celebrate women's past and present contributions, greater inclusion of female saints, theologians, and mystics in preaching, teaching, and catechesis, and finally, the full implementation of existing and possible opportunities for women's roles in church. So we're playing for all the marbles here tonight at the Catholic Information Center. We've invited each guest speaker to introduce us to 3 or 4 women, highlighting the historical context and the gifts that they expressed through their leadership, gifts that we believe are still needed today. Our hope is that you will stop and catch your breath with the recognition that she's my foremother in faith. I have her gift of mercy. I have her talent for teaching. I have her gift of generosity. That we might recognize our own gifts that the Spirit has given in the gifts that will be shared tonight through the women that are introduced to us. But I'd like to share 2 insights that was actually shared for all of us, for several of us, this past summer by Cammie Beecroft. She shared that remembering their story helps us to name our own sense of place in the continuity of faith and the continuity of faith-filled followers of Christ. We garner a deep sense of gratitude for these women because we come to recognize that we stand on their shoulders. And in our remembering, it is not uncommon to feel grief as we come to learn these things about women that we didn't know before. We acknowledge that women's stories are not always readily available to us, and that often it brings a sense of lament over what has been lost. And as Cammie invited us to do, I offer that if you're feeling a touch of grief or disappointment, or maybe even anger this evening, to welcome it, to embrace it, to trust the stirring of the Holy Spirit in you, to breathe with it. Additionally, because we are men and women of the 21st century with 21st century sensibilities, we are invited to suspend our judgments and to approach this evening with curiosity. Today, there is a wealth of historical documentation in archaeology and academic work being done by women theologians to resurrect and to bring to light the role that women have played in church throughout history. And this evening, we are delighted to invite one such woman theologian, Sister Barbara Reid. Sister Barbara is a Dominican sister of Grand Rapids and President Emerita of Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. And she is the Carroll Stuhlmueller Distinguished Professor of New Testament Studies. She is also the general editor for the Wisdom Commentary Series, a new 58-volume feminist commentary on the Bible published by Liturgical Press. Sister Barbara received a Master of Arts from Aquinas College, woohoo, go Saints, and her Ph.D. from Catholic University of America, go Cardinals. And Dr. Reid will guide us through the lives of some of the earliest disciples of Jesus that we find in the New Testament. Please help me welcome Sister Barbara Reid.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you all for the warm welcome. It's wonderful to see many familiar faces and new friends and faces. Welcome, everyone, on this St. Phoebe Day, which is a great day to kick off this series, as Mark said. And so I would like to, I'm delighted with the title that you've chosen, Women of Vision. And I want to focus my comments tonight on women in the New Testament who shared that vision of Jesus in the early Jesus movement. And two that I want to focus on in particular. I'll begin with Phoebe, and I will also speak about an apostle who's named in the New Testament and one of her best friends. It's hard to restrict these to just 3 or 4 women because they all had a lot of friends. And you can't talk about one without including all the others. So if others keep sneaking their way in, please welcome them. I want to also begin by saying that when we start trying to talk about women in the New Testament, so about 20 years ago, maybe 30 now, one of my colleagues, Carroll, who also taught New Testament at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, along with me, she was telling a relative that she was teaching an upper level seminar on women in the New Testament. And he said, well, that'll be a short lecture. Because for a long time, nobody noticed how many women there were in the story. And were not very curious about their story. And so just glossed over them. Of course, things have changed dramatically in the years since then. And so now you can't possibly fit it all even into a whole course, much less a one evening presentation. So what I want to start with, though, is that the sources that we have about the women who shared Jesus's vision in those early years, we have literary sources, we have the Gospels and Paul's letters, we have literary sources from outside of the scriptures, we have archaeological evidence that helps us reconstruct what their lives would have been like. And so I'll share a little bit of that with you tonight, as well as the biblical evidence. But I also want to dispel some false notions and some myths about some of what we know or think we know about women in the New Testament. And I want to start by pointing a finger at who told the story and how the story gets told really makes a difference in what we think we know or don't know about the women that were part of the early Jesus movement. There's an African proverb, maybe you know it, where a young boy is asking his father, he says, "Father, is it true that the lion is the king of the jungle and the most powerful animal on earth?" The father said, "Yes, my son, that is true." And the young boy says, "But Father, every tale that we have of men encountering, the men always win. And he said, yes, my son. He says, well, Father, how can that be if the lion is the most powerful of the animals? And the father says to the young son, and so it will be told that way, my son, until the lion starts telling the story. So I want to invite you to bring your imagination into the session tonight and try to bring your imagination into the session tonight in a way that might ask questions you hadn't thought of asking before, or expand your imagination of what were these women's lives like as they were followers of Jesus. And so I do want to start with Phoebe, who we find in the 16th chapter of Paul's letter to the Romans. We've got only 2 short verses about Phoebe, and I'm going to see if I can fit in everything that I can say about her in half an hour, about 2 verses. But let's, for your recollection, let's just recall what those 2 verses say in Romans 16. So Paul, at the end of his letters, he's always sending greetings to the folks at the destination. So this is the beginning of the greetings section, and it goes on. This is his most lengthy greetings. And he begins by saying, I commend to you our sister Phoebe. So he's entrusting this letter to Phoebe to take to the church in Rome. And here's what he says about her. So this is his introduction of Phoebe to the church at Rome. And he says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church at Cenchreae, so that you may welcome her in the Lord as is fitting for the saints, and help her in whatever she may require from you, for she has been a benefactor of many and of myself as well. There's a lot in those 2 verses that he tells us about Phoebe. So let's unpack what we can and try to piece together what would Phoebe's role have been, what would her life have been like. So we find her coming from she's the head of the host church at Cenchreae. She's deacon of the church at Cenchreae. So if your biblical geography is a little rusty, so Cenchreae is one of the port cities for the major city of Corinth. The other port is Lekion on the Gulf of Corinth. So Corinth was a very bustling city, and ships would come through the Gulf of Corinth, pass over that narrow isthmus between the mainland and the Peloponnese Peninsula, and on into the Saronic Gulf, or vice versa. And so Corinth was a bustling city, as was the port of Cenchreae. So first of all, Phoebe's a big city girl. She's not a rural peasant like many of Jesus's first followers. And the next thing that he says about her is, she is deacon of the church at Cenchreae. So we might think we know what a deacon does now, but whatever you think that is the job of a deacon now, put that on a shelf for a moment and consider what that role was in Paul's day. First of all, there's nobody ordained for any ministries yet at this stage in the early church. And the word diakonos, the person who does the diaconal ministry, the other words to know are the verb form diakonein, to diaconate, and the noun diakonia, which is the service or the ministry that a diakonos does. Now, what does a diakonos do? Well, we don't have any prescribed roles for anybody in any of the ministerial roles yet in the church. But what we do have is the word diakonia and the verb diakonein are used very frequently in the Gospels and in Paul's letters. So one of the first things we would notice is that in the Gospels, in the Synoptic Gospels, there is a saying that you'll recognize in Mark's version is in chapter 10, verse 45, where Jesus describes his mission in terms of diaconia. And so he says, I have come not to be diaconated to, not to be served or to be ministered to, but to diaconate, to minister to others. And all the synoptic gospels have that saying. In Luke's gospel, the saying comes at the Last Supper scene in chapter 22, where Jesus equates diaconal ministry with leadership, when he will say that those who want to be the leader of all must be the diakonos of all, or actually uses the verb form there, but you get the point, right? So it's equated with leadership. In Acts chapter 1, where the apostles are choosing a replacement for Judas, we get the expression that combines apostle and diakonos. And so you get apostolic ministry as another form of diaconia. Another text to look at is in Acts chapter 6, where there's a dispute among the Hellenists, the Greek speakers, and the Hebrews in Jerusalem, the Hebrew speakers in Jerusalem, over ministry of the widows of their communities. And the resolution that they come up with is that they are going to choose seven Greek speakers who are going to be dedicated to the diaconia of the table. So that's everything to do with Eucharistic celebration. The others, Peter and the 12, want to themselves diaconia of the word. And so we see a distinction between diaconia of the word and diaconia of the table. If you keep reading Acts of the Apostles, though, you will notice that it breaks down instantly, because Philip, who's one who is chosen for diaconia of the table, what do we see him doing? Just another chapter later, preaching, evangelizing. So there's no hard and fast divisions between diaconia of the table and diaconia of the word. There are also places where diaconia clearly indicates financial ministry. So in Acts 11:29 and 12:25, Paul's collection for Jerusalem, he calls a diaconia. So financial ministry. The other one I'm going to come back to and spend a little more time with is in Luke 8:3, where Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Susanna are bankrolling the mission, and it is, and the word diaconia, the verb diakonane is used in that text. I'm going to come back to that one. There's two more places in Acts of the Apostles where diaconia sums up all the different kinds of ministries that Paul has been doing. And then we'll get qualifications for those who engage in diaconia in 1 Timothy 3. And it's interesting in that text that Paul will first say, deacons should have these qualities. And then in verse 10, it says, women likewise should have these qualities. And many people have interpreted, well, that's wives of deacons. The grammatical construction argues very strongly in favor of that being instructions for women deacons should likewise have these qualities. But notice in that text, when you get a chance to look that up on your own, that it's giving the qualities that make for a good leader, a good minister, but it doesn't give the role description. So if we're asking, so what did Phoebe do as diakonos of the church at Cenchreae? What kind of ministry was she doing? Was she a rich woman who had the means to open her house up to the community and host the community and pay for the supper when they would get together? Probably. Was she doing preaching at those gatherings? Was she leading the Eucharistic celebration? Was she ensuring that the ministries of evangelization and tending to those who were needy were being taken care of? Probably. We don't have a job description for her, but what we can piece together is what we know of, how they used that word for the ministries in the early church. She could have been doing any and all of those kinds of ministries. It's the other thing that Paul says about her is in verse 2. He says that she has, now the translation I read for you is, she has been a benefactor of many and of myself as well. The word prostatis, which the NRSV translates as benefactor, if you take a look at your own translation at home, so here's your first homework for tonight. Take a look, or maybe you have your Bible with you. Take a look and see, how do they translate that word in Romans 16:2? The old version of the RSV translated it, she has been a helper of many. The New English Bible translates, she has been a good friend of many. The NIV translates, she has been a great help to many. Those translations, I think, are very unhelpful because it's missing the mark of what, first of all, what prostatis literally means, and it's clouding over the role that she had as patron of that community in Kenkreaid. Benefactor comes a little closer to it, but patron is an even better translation for it. What did a patron do? In the Greco-Roman world of this time, people who had money and status had clients. And what did the patrons do? They would make loans. They would use their personal influence for their patrons. They would help them with their business endeavors. They might pull some strings for business associates of theirs. They might write letters of introduction for their patrons. They might use their political influence. And you're thinking, did women have that kind of influence? You bet they did. And that's one of the first myths that I want to dispel for us, is that it's not true that all women in the ancient world were stay-at-home moms with no influence, and they did work outside the homes. They were teachers, they were hairstylists, they were spinners, they worked in textiles, like Lydia, who we find in Acts 16. They were tent makers, like Prisca in Acts 18, and she's also mentioned by Paul in the next verses of Romans 16. They were mosaic workers, they were jewelers, they were musicians, singers, actors. They sold produce in the markets. They were restaurant owners and workers. They were physicians. They were even gladiators and athletes. So what about Phoebe? Where did she get her money? And was she employed in one of those industries? Or did she inherit her money? Unfortunately, we don't know. But she's a woman of influence. In this system of patronage, if you're a patron and you are doing all these things for your clients, what do you get out of it? Well, your clients come to visit regularly, not only to keep asking you for more, but also to thank you over and over. And if your clients have enough means, they might put up a plaque in your honor right in the middle of the town square, or they might even commission a statue in your honor. So some of the patrons that we know about from the ancient world, we know because of the inscriptions that have been found in archaeological excavations. We haven't found any for Phoebe, so we don't know for sure where she would have gotten her money and how exactly she would have used her influence. What Paul does say, and this is important, In Greek literature, the word prostatis referred to political leadership. So somebody who has influence in the political sphere. So leader or ruler would be an appropriate translation. In the Roman period, it's better translated as patron. And as I already just described what patrons were doing. But look at what Paul says at the very end about her. He says, she has become a prostatis, a leader, a presider, a patron of many and of myself as well. That doesn't always fit our image of Paul, who we often think of as a Lone Ranger missionary who does it all on his own. He's acknowledging the help and the influence that he has from this influential woman in Cenchreae, which is the port city of Corinth. And Paul stayed in Corinth about 8 months the first time around and went back 2 more times that we know of during his lifetime. So he had enough time to make strong connections with Phoebe. Of course, we also know he made very good friends with Prisca and Aquila, who were in the same business that he was. They were tent makers or leather workers like he was, which was a great business to be in if you were an itinerant preacher, because all you have to carry is your needle and thread with you, and you get your skins when you get to the place where you're settling down. And then Paul describes in his letter to the Thessalonians, he uses this phrase of preaching while I'm working. And you can picture him sitting with Prisca and Aquila in their shop and taking orders. And while he's stitching up your sandal that has a broken strap, oh, have you heard about the good news that we have to share here? And you start introducing people to Jesus while you're working. Was Phoebe rich enough that she didn't have to work with her hands? Maybe. Now, had she inherited money? Maybe. Was she educated? What happened once she got to Rome? Did she herself read the letter out in the assembly? I want to suggest that it's quite probable, because a woman of means in a big city would have had access to education. And so she would have been able to read the letter that Paul had entrusted to her. And she would be used to public speaking as being a woman of influence. So what else can we say about Phoebe? We have very little else to go on. But what we can say is that she's not the only woman of influence. We know of a great many other Greco-Roman women who exercise their influence in a very substantial way. I'll just introduce you to one of them. She's not in the Bible, but Plancia Magna was a woman who lived in the late 1st, early 2nd century. She was a great civic leader who reconstructed the city gates of the city of Perga, which is in present-day Turkey. And it's one of the churches of Revelation. And we have inscriptions that tell all about how wonderful she was and how generous she was and how grateful the city is for her patronage. So another thing that we can surmise about patrons is patrons did not just have individual clients, but there were women who were patrons of entire cities and received great adulation for their patronage and their influence, and using their money and their influence for the benefit of the city and all of the citizens. Was Phoebe known that way too? Maybe. Could be. Phoebe's influence as deacon extends far beyond the small little circle of people. Well, not so small probably, because there were so many people coming through Cenchreae. She had the ability to influence a great many people. But her legacy continues on in all the other women deacons that there were in the early church. We have only the name of Phoebe in the New Testament as the only named deacon in the New Testament. But if there was one of the principles that we want to use is the tip of the iceberg principle. If there was one whose name we know, you can be very sure that there were a whole lot more whose names are now lost to us. This epitaph, this inscription, was on a tombstone, and it was only found in 1903. It was found on the Mount of Olives, where there are lots and lots of tombstones. It dates from the 4th century, and Sophia the deacon, the second Phoebe, she fell asleep in peace on the 21st of the month of March, and then the rest of it is incomplete. But we know that women continued to exercise diaconal ministries long the time of Jesus and the very early church. As you know, the group Discerning Deacons has adopted St. Phoebe as their patron and is working hard to restore the diaconate in our own day for women. I'll say another remark about that at the very end. I want to also point out that in this same letter to the Romans, Paul not only greets Prisca and Aquila, who were co-workers with him and founders of the house church in Ephesus, but he also greets his co-workers in Mary, Tryphena, Tryphosa, Persis, and then in the letter to the Philippians, Evodia and Syntyche. I want to call attention to the fact that co-worker, think about the implication of, there's lots of terms Paul could have used, but his frequent term for those who work with him in the ministry is co-worker. And he uses it for women and men as well. But think about what co-worker implies of a certain egalitarianism and a certain side-by-sideness that's very clear in what he says about Evodia and Syntyche. And I put the whole quote for you on your handout from Philippians 4, verses 2 and 3, where he's urging Evodia and Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. He says, and I ask you, my loyal and help these women, for they have struggled beside me in the work of the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names are in the book of life. That word, they have struggled with me, the word in Greek is sunethlesan. Sun means with, athleo, can you hear athletic in there? That they are straining every muscle like an athlete alongside him. So one of the things to notice is if we have the notion that women were always subordinate to men in the early church and that they were always in the shadows, not if we're reading Paul literally what he says. First of all, acknowledging that Phoebe was more influential than he was in the church at Cenchreae, and here in Philippi, that the women Evodia and Syntyche, who quite likely were heads of house churches in Philippi, and that he is acknowledging their great efforts in working right alongside him and the other male co-workers to spread the gospel. Of the 30 people that Paul greets in Romans, in Romans 16, it's notable that 11 of them are women. Another thing that I want to call attention to is that we have the names of quite a number of women who were heads of house churches. And we get them from Paul's letters and from Acts of the Apostles. But there were women like Nympha and Phoebe, as we've already said, Prisca, Lydia, Mary, possibly Chloe, possibly Mary of Bethany, who welcomed Jesus into her home in Luke 10:38. What were women heads of house churches doing? We don't have a job description, but what we know about household managers is that they would have been overseeing everything that happened within their house. And if they had a big home, if they were rich women, if they had servants, if they had children, if they had clients and patrons, they're managing not only the household work, but also the finances for the family and the business doings for the family. Wouldn't it be natural then that when the church is meeting in their house, they're also taking the lead in everything that's happening, both in setting up, executing, seeing that it was all cleaned up and followed up on when the church meets in their house. I mentioned Prisca and Aquila already, but I want to call attention to one more that's in Paul's letter to the Romans in chapter 16, verse 7. There, Paul says to greet Andronicus and Junia, who were his relatives, who were notable among the apostles. Now, Junia is a woman's name. And so, if you ask most Christians in the pews, less educated than you are in this room, but if you ask most Christians, how many apostles were there? What's the answer? And what gender are they? Yes. And are there any others?
Yes.
There's quite a few others. So apostle means one sent. Apostolos is one sent. Paul himself insists that he's an apostle. He's not one of the 12. He calls Apollos an apostle. He's not one of the 12. Barnabas, Epaphroditus, Silvanus, Timothy, all of these are named apostles in his letters, but then let's back up again to Junia, Andronicus and Junia. We don't know another thing about Junia. All we know is that she was quite notable back then, and what they knew about her is now lost to us. There is a woman named Junia Rustica that we do know about, who lived at the end of the 1st century, early 2nd century, and she was priestess of the city of Castina, which is currently in what is Spain, southern Spain, near Malaga. And we know from inscriptions that she restored public porticos, she built bathhouses and put up statues, and was a civic patron. Whether this Junia had anything to do with that Junia is doubtful, but Junia is certainly a woman's name and the name of another patron that was very well known in the ancient world. So, you know, the other woman apostle who was called apostle to the apostles early on in our tradition, and that's Mary Magdalene. At least as early as Hippolytus of Rome, she was called apostle to the apostles. Now, the word apostolos is not used of her in the text, in the Gospels, but she does appear in every one of the 4 Gospels, and she is most well known for being the one to convey the good news to the others. I want to ask though, if you've ever noticed how different the 4 versions of the Gospels are in what they say about Mary Magdalene. And this goes to my point of who gets to tell the story and how the story is told. So, and how she is depicted in our early Christian artwork. For some reason, if you Google Mary Magdalene, now today it's changing, but if you Google Mary Magdalene and ask for images, these kinds of images are going to come up. This one by Titian, of penitent Mary Magdalene, because if you ask, still, this is changing, but still many Christians have the notion that they know all about Mary Magdalene. What do they think they know about her? She's a fallen woman. She's a sinner, and they're very sure they know what kind of sinner, right? And where is that in the Bible? Nowhere. What is in the Bible is that in all four Gospels, she and other women followed and diaconated with Jesus. And in all four Gospels, she's there at the crucifixion. She sees him die. She sees him buried. She is the first to the tomb. And in two of the four Gospels, she's commissioned by the risen Lord to tell the other apostles. I wish I knew why painters and Christians who tell the story of Mary Magdalene find it more fascinating to depict her as a fallen woman who has found her way back to Jesus. It gets much more play than a woman who has been a faithful disciple who faithfully tells the story at the end of each of the Gospels. The other thing that is very puzzling is the way she gets confused with so many other women, mostly nameless women in the Gospels. One is there is a story of a woman who was forgiven many sins, and by the way, it never says what kind of sins, in the middle of Luke's Gospel, chapter 7, verses 36 to 50. Remember the story of the woman who comes into the dinner party at the home of Simon the Pharisee, weeps over his feet, dries them with her hair, and kisses his feet repeatedly, pours out ointment on his feet. And she's making a big scene because she doesn't care. She is so free. She has been forgiven many sins. We don't know what. She has been forgiven, and she is just so full of joy and delight, and she doesn't care what kind of scene she's making. She's got to demonstrate this lavishly toward Jesus. Who's that woman? We don't have her name. It's not in the gospel. There's another woman who anoints Jesus in Mark and Matthew's gospel. That's just at the beginning of the Passion narrative. And she also anoints Jesus in Mark and Matthew. She anoints his head, which is exactly what Samuel does to identify the king, anointing King David and King Saul for kingship. And in those two gospels, the theme of Jesus as king is very strong in the Passion narrative. What's that woman's name? Anonymous. The story ends with, this will be told in memory of her, but her name is never told in memory of her. We don't know who she was, but it wasn't Mary Magdalene. There's one last version of that anointing story, and that's in John's Gospel in chapter 12. And that woman does have a name, and it's Mary. But that's Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. That's not Mary Magdalene. And so there's also one other that Mary Magdalene gets confused with, and that's the story of the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8. What's that woman's name? We don't know. It's not in the text. So how did we get all those women mixed up with Mary Magdalene? Thank you, Pope Gregory the Great, whose feast day is today. In an Easter homily, he conflated them all together. And so we're still having a hard time separating out the real Mary Magdalene from the other women in the gospel stories that they get conflated with. Mary Magdalene also has been confused with another Mary, Mary of Egypt, who was painted by this painter in the 15th, 16th century. Penitent Mary Magdalene is on the left, and penitent Mary of Egypt is on the right. Mary of Egypt was supposedly a sinner, a sinful woman who went off into the desert to do penance. And as the myth goes, her clothes disintegrated eventually, and her hair grew long and covered her body. But that is not Mary Magdalene's story. If you want to know more about Mary of Egypt, I recommend Bonnie Thurston's book about Mary of Egypt, but that's not Mary Magdalene. And then, of course, there are the myths around Mary Magdalene that Dan Brown helped to helped to make popular in his 2004 book, The Da Vinci Code. And according to Dan Brown, Mary was pregnant with Jesus's child and went to France, where her descendants eventually founded the Merovingian line of kings. So there is a tradition that dates back some 2,000 years that Mary Magdalene, along with Salome and Mary, the mother of James, Martha, Lazarus, and Maxime, and their Egyptian servant Sarah, that they were cast out to sea and left to die. But miraculously, their boat was landed in Provence, in France, and the place that's now called Sainte-Marie de la Mer, Saint Mary of the Sea. And today, that town is a great pilgrimage site for the Romani people, who come to worship their patron, Saint Sarah, also known as Black Sarah for her Egyptian skin. And they have a big procession every year where an icon of the Blessed Saint is carried into the sea. And as for Mary Magdalene, the myth says that she joined Lazarus and helped him convert the people of Marseille to Christianity. And then, as the legend goes, Mary eventually goes to the mountains to the east, and she settles into a grotto, and she spends decades in prayer and penance. And today, the cave of the grotto at Saint-Baume, the cave of Saint Mary Magdalene, is the place where her bones are said to be. Since the middle of the 19th century, the Dominican friars have had a small monastery there. We Dominicans, the order of preachers, we claim Mary Magdalene as our patron. However, don't tell my dear brothers, there is no historical evidence for any of this myth of Mary having made it to Marseille and having, having preached. There is a chapel at Aix-en-Provence where Mary Magdalene was thought to have, where her bones are thought to be buried, but again, no historical verification. So these are all myths that have accrued around Mary Magdalene. What is true is that she was a very influential figure in the early church, and all these myths have preserved her memory and embellished on it pretty imaginatively. But there is much to be recovered in the Gospels themselves about her actual story. So let's talk about that. Oh, before I do though, you might also remember that there are some not so pretty memories of Mary Magdalene, because the name Magdalene, as you know, has come to be associated with institutions for women who have been trapped in the sex trade. And so we know of the so-called Magdalene laundries or Magdalene asylums in Ireland in the 18th to the 20th centuries, and the tragic history of the abuse that women in those institutions suffered is a very shameful part of history. Others who claim Magdalene's name, like the Magdalene House in Chicago, offer a place of healing for women who have survived trafficking and prostitution, addiction, and homelessness. But let's go to the Mary Magdalene of the Gospels. And I know you know her story, but I want to highlight a few things to dispel other myths about Mary Magdalene and other women, because she's not the only one who would have been exercising these kinds of ministries. So all four Gospels, as I mentioned, speak of her having followed Jesus and ministered with him, but only Luke puts her in the story before you get to the end. So when we get Luke's version of the gospel, if we go to chapter 8, verses 1 to 3, Luke tells us, and I think I put those verses, yes, I did, on page 2 of your handout, that Jesus is traveling from town and village, and he's preaching and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God, and the 12 were with him, as well as some women who had been cured of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene. By the way, every time Mary is with other women, she's always named first, which tells us something of her prominence and her influence. From whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward Chuza, and Susanna, and many others, who ministered to them out of their own resources. Ministered there is the verb diakonein, and it's in the imperfect, which means they were doing this repeatedly in the past. What can we say from those scant details that Luke gives us? He doesn't tell us how they met. He doesn't tell us whether Mary Magdalene was married. He tells us Joanna was married, but we don't know whether Mary was married, widowed, divorced, never married. It's unusual that a woman in the Bible would be named without reference to her husband or son. She is identified by the town from which she comes. And what we do know is that Magdala was a very important fishing village. On the right-hand side, you see a mosaic of a fishing boat from the 1st century in Magdala. And the Hebrew name for the town would have been Migdal, which means tower. So it's an important fishing village. It had a tower, likely, that guided ships to port, but it also might have been a tower where they were smoking fish. We know that salted smoked fish were one of the main exports from Magdala. So today it's still abounding with fish. Did Mary and her companions meet Jesus similar to the way that the fishermen Peter, James, and John met Jesus? Maybe. One of the things that, how many people in the room have been to Magdala? Just 2. As soon as things get better in Israel, Palestine, come with us, I'll show you Magdala. So this is an aerial view of what it looks like more recently. The Legionnaires of Christ acquired the property in 2009. There had been excavations done there in the 1970s by the Franciscans. And some years ago, I was determined I was going to show the group that I was guiding through Israel. I was determined we were going to go see Magdala. And so I asked the bus driver to take us to Magdala. And he says, "What, you want to go to the falafel stand for lunch?" And I said, "No, I want to go to the site where the excavations are." But so he shrugged his shoulders and he took us to a field. It was all covered over. You couldn't see anything of the excavations from the 1970s. It had all been grown over. And to me, that was a very good metaphor for the covering over of, of the real story of Mary Magdalene and so many other women in the early church. So I am grateful that the Legionnaires of Christ have acquired the property in 2009. They have done extensive archaeological excavations. They've now built a guest house, a chapel, a very interesting, that's the altar, the boat, the altar in the shape of a boat. You can see the Sea of Galilee out through the window. It's very dramatic, very beautiful. But they have been doing excavations there that have brought to light much of the city now. And we can see a synagogue, a gathering place. We can see homes. We can see all kinds of things now. What I want to also look at is what does Luke say about Mary? First of all, he says that she had been very ill. So he says that she had had 7 demons cast out of her, meaning, in those days they used demon possession to refer to very many different kinds of illnesses that today we would have more other kinds of medical terminology to describe. But for the ancients, it was a demon was possessing a person who was sick. And if she had 7 demons, 7 is the perfect number, and so it means she was really sick. There are some who would like to take that detail and say she was really, really crazy. And at the end of the story, when Luke says, and don't believe, they didn't believe her and the others, it's because she's crazy. And I would like to tell it a different way. What the gospel is stressing is she was very her wellness and her resources now for the mission. The last verse says that these women were diaconating out of their resources. And it's a really important term that we are given there, because this is one of the few instances where we're told exactly what kind of diaconia they were doing. And it's financial ministry. Resources, the word in Greek is huparkanton, which refers to monetary resources. The other thing to notice is that they're ministering out of their resources. The possessive pronoun autais is feminine plural. So the money belongs to the women, and they are using their money to bankroll the mission. As I already shared with you, women were involved in all kinds of professions and could earn their own money and had control over their own money. We know of a Jewish woman, for example, named Babatha, who lived in the early 2nd century, and we have letters and legal documents that tell about her transactions, her financial transactions, and gives us a picture of how women in Mary Magdalene's day, Mary's a little younger than Babatha was, but how women in those days did have control over their finances. It's not true that the husband had control over a woman's money if she was married. It's not true. The woman kept control, legal control over her own money. The dowry he might have use of, but it still belongs to her and her family, and not to him. So Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Susanna are using their money to bankroll the mission, and they don't need their husband's permission to do it. However, I would love to be at the dinner table with Joanna and Chusa. Chusa's working for Herod. He's Herod's steward. I picture them as having the kinds of discussions that one of my relatives, who's very far left-leaning politically, has with her husband, who is very right-leaning politically. And I would love to imagine what Chusa and Joanna, how they went about resolving her involvement with the Jesus ministry. You remember that in Luke's gospel too, Herod kept wanting to see Jesus. One of my friends, who's a scholar, Marianne Savitsky, her hypothesis is that Joanna helps keep Jesus out of his clutches for as long as she possibly can by using her influence through Chusa, and keeps on keeping Jesus away from Herod. And it's only when Jesus, it's only at the end of the gospel that Jesus is taken into custody, and Herod finally sees Jesus at the end of the gospel, and he and Pilate become friends over that. So they're using their resources to bankroll the mission. They're business partners with Jesus. They are, I want to make one other suggestion about Mary's status as a financier, her status in the community, her status as a patron, most likely, and her status in the Christian community, and that it may be that her name, Mary of Magdala or Mary Magdalene, it may be that it doesn't come from the city that had the tower at all, that it may be that it's referring to her towering stature. So Mary, who was known as towering or great, magnificent for her faith and ministry is what Origen and Eusebius of Caesarea and Jerome said of her. And so it may be that Mary, power in Mary because of her influence and her power, both in the civic world and in the Jesus circles. So I want to just say very briefly a word about where Mary appears at the end of each gospel and the 4 different versions of how the gospels end. Mark's gospel, the women go to the tomb, and after they find the tomb empty and the young man in white gives them the message to go back to the Galilee, it ends with them saying, "So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." End of story. That's a terrible ending for a gospel, isn't it? Well, so did many of the ancient scribes think that too. And so if you open your Bible, you're going to find verses 9 to 20. After that last verse 8, they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. You're going to find what's called the shorter ending. And then you're going to find what's called the longer ending. You're going to find 9 to 11, where Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene, and 12 to 13, he appears to 2 disciples. Sounds an awful lot like the Emmaus story. I think that scribe was copying. He's going to fail in my class. And then we're going to have a commission, and then we're going to have an ascension. Oh, copying again from Luke. What do all these other scribes do? I said, that's no way to end the gospel. Here, we got to fix it up. All the other gospels have resurrection appearance stories, so they add happily ever after endings, which wrecks the whole story. I really believe that Mark ended it on verse 8. And what is Mark doing? Rhetorically, if the women in the story don't tell, then it's left to the hearer of the gospel for you to tell the story. But there's one more thing that bothers me a lot. When people look at the women being terrified and amazed and painting them as weak, frail, can't handle the message. If you look at the literal meaning of traumas kai ekstasis in Greek, traumas is a trembling, not only with fear, but a trembling that comes with awe at a sacred mystery that's being revealed. And ecstasis in Greek, do you hear it, our English word ecstasis? It's what happens when you are transported by a manifestation of the divine and there are no words to convey what you have experienced. I want to suggest that the women have had such an experience at the empty tomb, and there is no way they can put into words. And so the story goes on. In Matthew's gospel, the women, as they're coming out from they encounter Jesus himself. So it's much the same story as Mark, but Matthew adds the twist. They encounter Jesus himself, who gives them the same message, and they worship him, and then they go and do as he says. But in Matthew, they're the first ones to see Christ. In Luke's gospel, Luke is a little more complicated. Luke will have them, he will say to the women, he will have the angels say why are you looking for the living among the dead? He's not here, he has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Humanity must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the 3rd day rise again. And they remembered his words, returning from the tomb, and told all this to the 11 and all the rest. Notice, please, that remembering in Bible speak is not just intellectual recall, it is make it present again. So the women are making present again all that they learned from Jesus while we were on the road with him. The other thing to notice is that the word for told is in the imperfect. And it means they told it over and over and over. And so the women, it's not a one-time message, but it is a repeated evangelization that they are giving. In Luke's gospel, it's very disappointing that when the women go and report to the others, they're not believed, and they're crazy. They're not believed. We can do two different things with that ending. We can say in one direction, yep, you don't give that kind of a message to women. You don't entrust evangelization to women. And it's the job of us men. And I think that's what Luke is convinced needs to happen in the time beyond the gospel, the telling of the resurrection story. He will have the first ones to appear are to Clopas and his companion on the road to Emmaus. That's the first resurrection appearance in Luke's gospel. But when the two go back to where the rest are gathered, they start to tell the story, and they say, wait, the Lord has appeared, the Lord is risen and has appeared to Simon. And wait a minute, there's no story of an appearance to Simon. Where did that come from? It's a very deeply embedded tradition in the Gospels, and it is giving primacy of place to Peter over Mary Magdalene. John's Gospel will tell it differently again, and it will be Mary Magdalene all by herself in John's Gospel. So we have two strands of tradition. In Matthew and John, Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene first. In Luke, it's Peter. In Paul's letter to the Corinthians, Peter's at the head of the list, and he names all the others, the 12, and then himself, and more than 500 of the brothers and sisters, and guess whose name is not on the list? So we have two ways of telling the story. To whom did Jesus first appear in our earliest traditions? There are implications, both for the formation of the ecclesia, of the faith community, and implications for who takes leadership, depending on how you tell the story. I don't have time to tell you about the extra-canonical Gospel of Mary. We'll look for another opportunity. In John's Gospel, one more time, we have the one thing that I want to point out is verse 17, when Jesus appears to Mary by herself. And one of the most misunderstood verses is when he says to her not to come to him. And I want to clarify one very bad interpretation of that line in the gospel, and that is that the reason why what Jesus is saying to her about clinging is, to me, the me that you knew as the earthly Jesus, to that me, don't cling. And then he goes on to say that he can be found in the gathered assembly, and go to those brothers and sisters and go and tell them. And she does. And there's no hint that she's disbelieved in John's gospel. A happy thing is that Pope Francis elevated Mary Magdalene's feast day to a feast day in July which is celebrated on July 22nd. I hope in your parishes you make a big deal of Mary Magdalene's feast day, just the same as we do for Peter and Paul. And I also am appreciative that Pope Francis has in Evangelii Gaudium, his very first apostolic exhortation, he talked about the presence of women must be guaranteed in the various settings where important decisions are made, both in the church and in social structures. He did set up two different commissions to study the question of women being ordained deacons. The first commission was dissolved and after their conclusions could not be agreed upon. He then set up another one, which was to study the question again. They were supposed to report a month after he died. The synod in October of 2024 and the one of October 2023 took up the question. And it is in the final document that with us at the outset that Pope Francis agreed to, that the women must be encouraged to do all of the ministries that canon law allows. When it comes to the question of deacons, the final document said it's still an open question, and there was a study group set up to study it. Their report is due in December. So I want to, I know I'm fast forwarding over some of this. I also find it very encouraging that the first woman to lead a Vatican dicastery was named by Pope Francis. And every indication that we're seeing and that I'm praying for is that our current Pope, who graduated from Catholic Theological Union, who was taught by women and who was taught the scripture, including the women, and who has worked with women all of his ministerial life, I think every indication is that he's going to continue in the same direction. So I'm sorry that I intended to stop a little sooner, but I want to invite your questions, comments, reflection. What does the stories of Phoebe and of Mary Magdalene say to you? How does it give you hope? What do they inspire you to do? I'd like to invite you to take 60 seconds for the sake of introverts in the room to think your own thoughts, gather your own thoughts, and then I'd like to invite you to take just a few minutes at your table to share your thoughts, and then we'll open it up to the whole group. Is that okay? And my apologies that I didn't leave enough time at the end for you to be able to interact. I want to invite if there's one or two comments to share with the whole group. Anybody who wants to continue discussing for a few more minutes after is very welcome, but I also want to respect your time when we said the ending time would be 8:30. Are there any questions, comments, observations that you want to share with the group?
Just
Wait for the mic. Yeah.
I have a question. A friend of mine and I were having a discussion about a topic like this a couple weeks ago. I just wonder if you have any thoughts to share about, you talked in the first half about how much Paul valued women as co-workers and so on and so forth. But then in 1 Corinthians 15, he doesn't mention Mary Magdalene. We were trying to decide why. We had two hypotheses, and maybe both of them are totally way off, but I'll tell you what we came up with. One was he was only giving judicial witnesses, and perhaps women weren't considered, qualified to give witness in court. Or two, he heard this list from another male disciple, and he was the person who didn't mention Mary Magdalene.
Yeah, I think the list does, I don't think Paul composed it. I think it's a very old piece of tradition that he embeds in his letter. Yeah, I was thinking about that myself too. It's that he never mentions her anywhere, but he didn't minister in Palestine. He's all over the Greco-Roman world. And unless all those myths about Mary Magdalene going to France are correct, he never would have encountered her personally. And he may just not have been aware of the circles of influence she had where she was. it didn't intersect with his, and the tradition that he inherited didn't have her in the list. Yeah. Please,
So
Betty.
I was hoping you'd get into the Gospel of Mary, because at one point the apostles are all cowering
Yeah.
in the upper room, and Mary comes in and says to them, you know, you gotta pull up your bootstraps and get out there. This is what Jesus told you to do. And then they say, yeah, she's right, let's go. So I love that, but you know, we've never heard of that before. I think for me personally, I feel seen in the church for the first time. And I think for women, we've always either been blamed with Eve or hidden, like all these women. And now I feel like finally we're being seen.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning the Gospel of Mary. What I wanted to point out there, you very well summarized the scene of the Gospel of Mary that I was going to share with the group. And it shows that controversy in the early church, it was live, you know, of dismissing Mary Magdalene's witness. And finally, Levi comes to her defense and says to Peter, you've always been of hasty temper, you know, and if the Lord chose her, who are we to say otherwise, you know? They end up listening to him, and they all go out and preach like Mary Magdalene was trying to get them to do.
Like she was an OP.
That's right, we claim her. Thank you.
So I guess mine is a question, but it's also a curiosity. When we look at Mary Magdalene and she's named with the 7 demons, and as you were sharing, that's all these illnesses and they can run the gamut. But yet from her resources, she foots the bill. So what I'm curious about is what family would let her have the pocket? What family would give her the resources to do that? And here yet she has the resources. So in some ways, what you linked for me was a new way to find her even more powerful. That she would have financial resources, even being that possessed by 7 demons.
Yeah, we don't know what her illness was. We don't know anything about her family, you know. But that she is bankrolling the mission, I think, puts her in the category of a rich patron, much like Phoebe. And, you know, we just don't think about the Galilean women that followed Jesus as being in that category of women. But if you read the rest of the Acts of the Apostles, you'll notice the number of times that Luke mentions that women of means or elite women in different cities during the Pauline missions convert. And he puts a lot of attention on rich women. And I think Mary Magdalene and her friends fall in that category. Rich women patrons who were very influential in spreading the gospel in the early days. And, you know, it may be that, and here I'm speculating, but it may be that some of that rivalry between Peter and Mary Magdalene is that she's got more influence because of her stature and her money. And he's, you know, and he's a peasant fisherman. Speculating. Anybody online that we want to hear from here? We've been reading your comments while people were talking. Thank you for those.
Yeah, here's one from Annie Karasinski. The stories of Phoebe and Mary Magdalene break open the narratives that I've heard my entire life. Sister Barbara, you've added a dimension to the slim history documented in the Bible and invites further imagination, especially using Ignatian imagination. My hope rests in claiming my agency to be the author of my own story as I seek to serve. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Annie. Appreciate it.
Any other comments or questions here in the house?
Betty, you're full of comments tonight. Thank you for that.
Let me get you the microphone, Betty.
I fell in love with Mary Magdalene during COVID, and I took a 6-week course with Cynthia Bourgeot online, and I just have been almost obsessed with Mary Magdalene ever since. But I'm so glad you said that the town was not called Magdala at the time, Because I think everybody says Mary of Magdalene, but she was called Mary the Magdalene, like Peter the Rock, often, at least in things that I've read.
Yeah, the thing to know about the town is that in Jesus's day, it was known by its Greek name, Taricheia, which is one of the arguments for why Mary might have been known as towering Mary because of her stature and not because of the town she came from. Yeah. Can I add one footnote that I skipped over and that I think might be helpful in your interpretation of Luke's version? You know, at the end where they don't believe the women after they give their witness, there is a way to read that ending of Luke's gospel in relationship to the beginning of the gospel, where he portrays three very strong women who are prophets: Elizabeth, Mary, and Anna. And then in chapter 4, we see Jesus make his appearance as prophet. And his opening lines in the synagogue at Nazareth are, he takes Isaiah's words and proclaims what his mission is going to be. And then you remember what happens in that scene? There's always a double reaction to a prophet. Whoever the prophet is lifting up are going to think that he's the greatest thing that ever happened, or she. And whoever's power, privilege, and status is being challenged are going to try to silence the prophet. And so the prophet, an authentic prophet, always experiences a dual reaction. And so there's a way that you can read the ending of Luke's gospel where the women are giving a utterance of what they have just been told to pass on. And a typical reaction to a prophetic utterance is it gets rejected. So one way of reading that ending of the story is that actually they're going to be vindicated because their word is true. And those who don't want to hear it from them are rejecting them, but they are speaking the true word. And that verb elegant, repeated telling over and over. It's not just once that they give their message. It's repeated telling over and over. It means they kept on evangelizing. And when the angel told them, remember means put it into action now. That's what they're doing from there on in.
Sister Barbara, thank you.
To Mark, and thank you so much for your time and faithfulness being with us.